My name is Abigail Monroe, and I can still hear the sound of that gunshot like it never stopped echoing inside my skull. It was July 2025 in Fayetteville, North Carolina. The kitchen light flickered above the sink, a tired fluorescent bulb buzzing softly against the silence that came right before my world shattered. My 6-year-old daughter lay on the cold linoleum floor in her pink pajamas with faded stars. Her small wrists were bruised, her lips slightly open as if she had tried to speak a word she never could. She had been mute since birth. That silence had always been a shield, but that night it felt like a scream trapped in glass. The air smelled of spilled bourbon and cordite. I could taste metal in my mouth. I remember staring at the refrigerator magnets, the bright blue dolphin, the red heart from a school fair, as if anchoring myself to something familiar would stop the terror from flooding my veins. It didn't. The back door creaked open. Douglas Kane. My stepfather stumbled in wearing a cheap gray suit with his tie loosened and his eyes glassy from whiskey. He had always known how to make a room smaller. That night he made it suffocate. His voice was low, almost lazy when he said she had been in his way. I knelt on the floor beside her, pressing my palm against her chest, begging for the tiny rise and fall that would tell me she was still here. My knees burned from the cold tile. My throat felt raw, even though no sound came out. For a moment, I thought time had split open and everything inside me was spilling onto that floor. Then the second sound came. A click. I turned. He was holding the gun like it was an extension of his hand, like he had always planned to end something this way. His mouth twisted into the same half-smile I had seen since I was 8 years old. That smile had been there when he crushed the sunflower necklace my grandmother gave me. It had been there when he told me no one would ever believe me. Now it hovered above a gun pointed at the woman I had fought so hard to become. His voice slurred, but his words were sharp. He said, "You think your uniform makes you untouchable. No one will care." I felt something cold and steady rise in me. Fear did not vanish, but it stopped owning me. I slid my hand slowly from my daughter's chest to her back, shielding her small body with mine. I could hear the refrigerator humming. I could hear my own pulse heavy and uneven. The light above us flickered again. I saw the gun shake slightly in his hand, not from guilt, but from arrogance. He thought he had already won. Then my training cut through the panic. The years at Fort Jackson, the ruck marches under Carolina sun, the sound of sergeants yelling discipline into bone. All of it sharpened the moment like glass under pressure. I reached for the phone on the counter while keeping my eyes on him. The smell of bourbon got stronger as he stepped closer. His voice grew louder, spitting words about how the army had made me arrogant, how the child had ruined everything, how he was tired of my defiance. I felt my shoulder brush the cold cabinet handle, and in that brief second, I saw the reflection of the kitchen in the microwave door. His silhouette, my daughter, my shaking hand. The gun angled down. I could calculate distance and breath. He fired again. The sound was louder than anything I had ever heard in a combat range. The bullet tore through the edge of the cabinet, and splinters burst like sparks across the floor. Pain bloomed across my left shoulder. It was shallow, but it was enough to remind me I was alive. My daughter didn't move. Her hand was still warm, and that warmth burned me alive. I whispered her name once, not expecting a reply, but needing her to hear me. Douglas laughed. Not loud, not wild, just enough to make the kitchen feel like a cage. I dragged myself and my daughter behind the kitchen island. My phone was in my hand. I dialed emergency services with fingers slick from sweat and fear. My training told me to stay quiet, to breathe slowly, to wait for an opening. But the mother in me screamed without sound. He started yelling something about how he would call the police first, how he would make sure they believed his version. That was when I saw his hand loosen just slightly on the gun. That was when the moment shifted. My gaze landed on the corner cabinet. Locked inside it was the old Glock I kept for emergencies. I had never wanted to use it. I had trained to defend, not destroy. But that night, every boundary I thought I had was cracked open. My daughter's fingers twitched against mine. I looked at her face, pale, fragile, silent, and something ancient and primal moved through me. It was not rage. It was the unbreakable instinct to protect what no one else ever would. I moved, not fast, not reckless, just precise. My blood smeared the floor as I crawled toward that corner. Douglas didn't expect it. He never thought I would fight him. For years, he had built himself on the belief that I would always stay small. But the thing about cages is that they teach you the shape of freedom. My hand closed around the cold steel. I rose just enough to meet his eyes. He saw it, the shift, the soldier in me standing where the girl used to kneel. The kitchen went silent except for his shallow breathing and the soft hum of the fridge. No words were left between us. He took one step forward. I raised the gun. My shoulder throbbed, but my hand didn't shake. For the first time in years, I was not afraid of him. Not the way he wanted me to be. I was no longer the child trapped in his house. I was a mother, a soldier, a line he could no longer cross. The operator's voice was a faint buzz in my ear, asking for my address, asking what happened. But my eyes stayed on him. He sneered, thinking he still held the power. He did not see that everything had already changed. The night was split in two, before the shot, and after. Where are you watching this from, and what would you do if it were your child? I grew up in a small wooden house with chipped white paint on the edge of Charleston, South Carolina. We had a creaky front porch that smelled like jasmine in the summer. My grandmother used to sit there every evening with a glass of sweet tea, humming old songs that never made it to the radio. My mother, Laura Monroe, always smelled like flour and soap from the bakery she worked at downtown. Back then, the world was still warm and safe, wrapped in the smell of baking bread and porch light. I was 8 years old when Douglas Kane stepped into our lives wearing polished shoes, a kind smile, and a voice that pretended to care. I didn't know back then that monsters don't always break doors down. Sometimes they knock softly and bring flowers. In the beginning, Douglas was charming. He carried groceries for my mom, fixed the broken screen door, and brought me peppermint candy wrapped in gold foil. He called me sunshine and ruffled my hair like some storybook father. My grandmother never trusted him, though. She said his eyes never smiled when his mouth did, but my mother wanted to believe in something better than working nights and raising a daughter alone. So she let him in. He came for dinner one humid night in August, and by October, his toothbrush was on the bathroom sink. By Christmas, his boots were next to the porch steps where my grandmother's had always been. By spring, the house smelled less like jasmine and more like his cologne, sharp and heavy, like something that didn't belong. The first shift was quiet. He started closing doors that were always open. The living room that once held my drawings on the wall suddenly had framed photos of him in a suit. He replaced my grandmother's rocking chair with a new leather recliner. He told me little girls should keep their things tidy, then threw out my sunflower dress because it was too childish. I cried so hard that night I made myself sick. My mother said he just wanted the best for us. She said he had been through a lot and I needed to be understanding. I didn't understand why understanding always meant losing something. When I was 9, I wanted to join the church choir. I practiced every afternoon on the porch, singing to the breeze. On the morning of the audition, I found my dress ripped in half and the bus schedule missing from the fridge. Douglas stood in the doorway drinking black coffee, smirking. He told me maybe I wasn't meant to be hurt anyway. That night, my mother said he didn't mean it. She said he had his demons. Those words would become the wallpaper of my childhood. Every bruise on my hope was covered with that same excuse. By 10, he had a key to every door in the house. He locked my bedroom at night and said it was to keep me safe from what I never knew. He installed a small camera in the hallway and told my mother it was for security. He never let me close my door fully. He would knock softly, pretending it was polite, but he never waited for permission. He started making me eat alone at the kitchen table, away from him and my mother. He said it was better that way, that I was too loud, too clumsy, too much. I began to believe him. There were small humiliations everywhere. At the grocery store, he would correct the way I spoke in front of strangers, gripping my shoulder until my skin burned under his fingers. At school events, he stood behind me, straightening my posture like I was a doll. At home, he took my allowance and said a child didn't need money. My favorite sunflower necklace disappeared one night after he told me I didn't deserve to wear something so bright. The next morning, he acted like it never existed. My mother looked at me like she wanted to say something, but her silence was already trained. When I turned 11, he started controlling the way I saw the world. He would read my mail before I did check my backpack, go through my drawers. He listened in on phone calls with my grandmother, always pretending it was nothing. I tried to tell my mother once, but she just lowered her eyes and whispered, "Please don't make things harder." That was the night I realized she wasn't my shield anymore. She was his silence. At 12, I stopped singing. I stopped drawing. I stopped bringing friends over because I couldn't explain why my stepfather followed me from room to room. My grandmother died that winter. The porch smelled like jasmine for the last time at her funeral. Douglas didn't let me wear the sunflower dress she loved. He said black was more appropriate. I stood by the casket wearing clothes that didn't feel like mine, and I made myself a promise I kept hidden deep. One day I would leave and never come back. The years bled into each other like watermarks on cheap paper. Douglas's control grew more subtle and more complete. He tracked every dollar my mother earned, deciding what could be spent and what couldn't. He started keeping receipts in a small metal box, his own little fortress. He monitored her phone. He told me college was useless for someone like me. He made jokes about me joining the military, said they would eat a girl like me alive. I laughed with him because it was safer than silence. But deep down, the seed of defiance was growing roots. When I was 15, I caught him taking pictures of me through a cracked door. It was late at night and the flash was weak, but I saw the shape of his hand in the faint red light of the camera. I didn't scream. I just stared at him, and he stared back calm, like he owned the air I breathed. The next morning, he acted like nothing happened. My mother folded laundry in silence. That day, I stopped asking her to protect me. By 16, I had become a ghost in my own house. My steps were quiet. My voice was quieter. I wore oversized hoodies and kept my eyes down. He liked that. He liked knowing he had turned me into a shadow. But I was still watching. I learned where he kept things, how he moved, how he spoke to people when he wanted to charm them. I learned how to make myself invisible and how to listen. That skill would save me years later when I needed to fight back. Every summer evening, the porch stayed empty. The jasmine vines wilted without my grandmother. The house became his territory, a place where my childhood was quietly erased. My mother repeated the same line like a prayer whenever I confronted her. He has his demons. He doesn't mean it, but he did. And she knew. The night I turned 18, I sat on that porch alone. The house behind me felt like a trap dressed as home. The stars above Charleston were dim through the humid air. I pressed the broken sunflower pendant I had hidden for years between my fingers and whispered to myself that I would get out. I didn't know how yet, but I knew the cage he built around me wouldn't last forever. The thing about cages is they never expect the bird to learn how to use the lock. That night I decided to enlist, not to run away, to build something no one could take from me again. I walked back inside and saw him asleep on the recliner he had claimed as his throne. My mother was sitting silently beside him, staring at nothing. I looked at her and understood that she was never going to save me. That was the night I stopped waiting to be rescued. That was the night I started building the version of me who would. I was 19 years old when I walked into the recruiting station on a sweltering August afternoon in 2016. The air outside Charleston was thick and heavy, the kind that made your shirt stick to your back before you took 5 steps. The sign on the glass door of the Army recruiting office looked like a lifeline. I didn't walk in because I thought I was brave. I walked in because I was tired of feeling small. The recruiter's voice was calm and steady, nothing like the walls of my house. He handed me the paperwork and asked why I wanted to join. I didn't tell him the whole truth. I just said, I want a future. By the end of that week, my enlistment was set, and 2 weeks later, I stepped off a bus at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. The heat there was merciless, baking the pavement until it shimmered like water. We lined up with duffel bags slung over our shoulders, boots stiff and new, sweat already soaking through the fabric of our uniforms. The first voice I heard was Drill Sergeant Davis. His voice could cut through steel. He didn't yell to humiliate. He yelled to strip away every excuse. The first week broke me open. The 4 a.m. wake-ups, the runs that felt endless, The ruck marches under a sun that didn't forgive weakness. My legs burned, my back screamed, and my mind whispered I couldn't do it. But every day I stayed standing was a day the cage around me cracked a little more. They taught us to move in formation, to breathe through the pain, to follow orders, and to trust the person on our left and right. In those moments of blistered feet and rasping lungs, I began to understand that strength wasn't something you were born with. It was something you built 1 mile at a time. Drill Sergeant Davis became more than a voice. He became the weight that forced me to grow muscle I didn't know I had. When I fell behind on a march, he didn't pity me. He looked me in the eye and said, "Your body will follow your mind if you let it." I carried that sentence like a weapon. Land navigation was the first time I realized I could trust myself. In the middle of the woods, compass and hand map spread out on the damp ground, I figured out how to find a point no one else could see. Marksmanship came next. At first, I flinched at the recoil, but the rhythm of breath and trigger slowly became second nature. Radio procedures, medical drills, tactical movements, all of it layered itself over the invisible girl who once kept her eyes down. By the time graduation came, my skin was darker from the sun, my boots were scuffed, and my hands were steady. When they called my name on that parade field, the sound of my boots striking the ground in step with the formation made something in me stand taller. I had never belonged to anything that didn't hurt me. This was the first time belonging meant power I had earned. After basic training came advanced training and then the first duty assignment. I learned the language of discipline. I learned to fold my uniform with precision, to keep my weapon spotless, to know my responsibilities before someone had to remind me. I chose my MOS and I threw myself into it with the hunger of someone who had spent her life being underestimated. Every test, every drill, every night in the field became a quiet rebellion against the version of me Douglas tried to build. By the time I pinned on E4, I wasn't invisible anymore. And when I earned E5, people started calling me Sergeant Monroe. That title wasn't just a rank. It was a wall between my past and my future. Leadership wasn't about shouting louder. It was about carrying weight even when your knees shook. The first time I was put in charge of a fire team, I lay awake all night, terrified I'd fail them. But when the sun came up and I looked at their faces, I realized they didn't need someone perfect. They needed someone who would not break. So I didn't. I learned how to take responsibility, how to keep my soldiers safe, how to trust them enough to lead them. There was a pride in that, the kind that doesn't have to be loud. The Army taught me practical things: how to stop bleeding, how to move without being seen, how to navigate terrain with nothing but a map and a compass. But what it really taught me was that no one could own me anymore. I had structure. I had a name that meant something beyond the house on the edge of Charleston. I became sharper, quieter, stronger. I learned how to breathe through fear until fear didn't lead me anymore. Deployment cycles came and went. Nights in the barracks bled into training rotations at Fort Liberty. Summers were marked by the sound of distant artillery and the smell of sweat and canvas. Winters were marked by long, cold mornings on the range with frost crusting the edges of my gloves. I grew used to the sound of helicopters cutting through night air, to the language of radio chatter, to the steady rhythm of boots on pavement at dawn. But it wasn't just about the uniform. It was about the person wearing it. I learned to stand with my shoulders back, not because anyone told me to, but because I had earned the right to stand. The girl who once whispered became the woman who gave orders clearly. The girl who once hid became the sergeant people trusted to get things done. That transformation didn't erase the pain. It gave it a purpose. I never forgot where I came from. On nights when the barracks went quiet and the world outside felt far away, I called home. I called to hear my daughter breathe on the other end of the line. She was born when I was 23. Her name was Lily. She never said a word, but her silence spoke louder than any sentence ever could. Every time I heard her small breath, it reminded me why I wore the uniform. It reminded me why I fought so hard to never be caged again. Some nights I sat alone on a bench near the motor pool, staring up at a sky filled with military aircraft and stars, thinking about the girl who had sat on that porch in Charleston whispering promises into the night. I kept that promise. I broke the lock. I built something that was mine. I became someone Douglas Kane could no longer crush. When I looked at myself in the mirror after a long day in the field, I didn't see the child he silenced. I saw Sergeant Monroe. I saw discipline and Scar's grit and quiet strength. I saw a woman who had built herself from the ground up, brick by brick, mile by mile. I didn't know then what storm was waiting for me years later, but I knew one thing for certain. If it came, I would meet it standing, and I would not back down, not ever, because everything I had built wasn't just for me, it was for her. I still remember the heat that rolled over the gate at Fort Liberty the morning I signed out on leave. July 2025, the kind of Carolina summer where the air clings to your uniform like another layer of fabric. I saluted the guard at the checkpoint, the smell of hot asphalt rising in waves, and for a moment I let myself imagine it would be a quiet 2 weeks. I told myself it would just be me, Lily, and my mother. No ghosts, no fights, no Douglas Kane. I should have known better. As I drove down the highway toward Fayetteville, the sky was bright, but the air in my chest felt heavy. I'd built a life out of structure and discipline, but home had always been the place where everything I built started to crack. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The porch steps were a little more worn paint peeling at the edges, and the jasmine vines were long dead. My mother stood at the door with her hands wrung tight against each other. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Douglas was behind her, dressed in a collared shirt and slacks, like he was trying to look respectable for someone who didn't deserve the word. He opened the door for me, and for a second, I almost forgot how to breathe. His smile was the same one he wore when I was 8 years old, the one that said, "Welcome back to the cage." He played the part well. He took my bags, asked polite questions about Lily, about the Army, about how long I was staying. To anyone else, it would have looked like a normal family reunion, but his eyes gave him away. They didn't soften. They didn't welcome. They measured. Lily clung to my leg as we walked inside, and I felt her small fingers tremble against my uniform. I squeezed her hand, twice the silent signal we'd shared since she was old enough to understand safety wasn't guaranteed. The living room had changed. Douglas's leather recliner sat like a throne in the corner, the walls lined with photos of him at charity events, golf tournaments, neighborhood barbecues. He had made himself the face of stability, but his shadow still filled every room. My mother hovered near the kitchen doorway, fussing with nothing like movement could make her invisible. I noticed the way Douglas glanced at Lily, not like she was a child, but like she was an object that existed in his house. Cold, dismissive, territorial. Dinner that night was quiet, too quiet. The clinking of silverware was louder than any conversation. Douglas asked about my re-enlistment. He asked about the bonuses. His questions were dressed as casual talk, but they were sharp underneath. He asked what I planned to do with the extra pay. I told him I was setting it aside for Lily's future. His smile twitched. He asked if I had thought about using it to help around the house. My mother's hand tightened on her glass. I said no. That was the first crack. The second came the next morning. I was sitting on the porch with Lily watching the sunlight spread across the yard when Douglas stepped out. He carried a cup of coffee and that same false kindness he used like a weapon. He asked about the check I'd mentioned, the deposit I planned to make for Lily's education. He wanted details. He wanted control. When I didn't give them, his jaw clenched. He leaned close enough that I could smell the coffee and the faint burn of whiskey hidden beneath it, even though it wasn't even noon. He told me families help each other. I told him family doesn't mean ownership. His eyes narrowed. Inside, my mother tried to smooth it over. She said he didn't mean anything by it. She always said that. But the way she avoided my gaze told me she was already scared. I watched her stir sugar into her tea, over and over the spoon, clicking against the glass like a clock counting down. Over the next few days, the house grew smaller. I noticed the way Douglas's eyes lingered on the envelope on the kitchen counter. I noticed how he walked past Lily's toys like they were intrusions. I noticed how my mother moved around him like someone navigating a live wire. Every step, every word, every silence pressed against me. I hadn't felt that trapped in years. 3 days in the argument finally surfaced. It started in the kitchen like it always did. The morning sun cut through the blinds, slicing light into thin lines across the counter. Douglas leaned against the fridge, holding the check I'd left in an envelope. He asked why I hadn't cashed it yet. He asked what kind of mother I was if I didn't trust my own family with my daughter's future. I told him to put it down. His smile faltered just enough to show what was underneath. My mother stood near the sink silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. Douglas started listing all the ways I'd failed this house, how I'd run off to play soldier while he'd taken care of everything. He said I owed him respect. He said Lily owed him gratitude. My hand tightened around the edge of the counter until my knuckles went white. I told him she owed him nothing. That was the third crack. The look he gave me then wasn't just anger. It was ownership being challenged. It was the same look I'd seen when I was a child, the look that said he believed everything here belonged to him. He straightened, stepped closer, and said, "Maybe it's time you stopped acting like this house isn't mine, too." My pulse pounded in my ears. Lily sat quietly at the table, coloring with a stubby crayon, unaware of the storm rising around her. I could feel the air changing. I had spent years learning how to read tension before it exploded. Douglas's voice was calm, but it was the calm of a man who enjoyed control too much to let go. My mother whispered something I couldn't hear. He didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on me. That night, after Lily fell asleep, I stood outside on the porch, the wood warm from the day's heat. I stared at the yard, at the shadows creeping across the grass. I felt the weight of the house behind me. I had come home hoping to rest, but the ground under my feet was already shifting. The cage I'd broken years ago was waiting rebuilt and waiting for me to step inside. I tightened my grip on the railing and whispered to the dark, "Not this time." But I also knew men like Douglas didn't let go of control quietly. Something was coming. I could feel it, and I was right. The night it happened, the air in the kitchen felt too still, like everything was holding its breath. It was late, almost past midnight, and the only light came from the weak bulb over the stove. Douglas had been drinking again. I could smell the bourbon before I even stepped out of Lily's room. His words were already slurred, but his eyes were sharp. That was always the worst combination. He was leaning against the counter when I walked in, one hand on the neck of a half-empty bottle, the other pointing at the envelope I had locked in the drawer. He asked me again where the money was going. His voice carried that sneer he always used when talking about my service. He called it my useless military paycheck, said it didn't make me better than him. I told him it was for Lily. That was the truth. It was always for her. He laughed that low laugh that made every inch of the kitchen feel smaller. He said a woman like me didn't deserve control over anything, that soldiers like me were nothing outside the gate. I felt the heat rise behind my eyes, not fear, yet just pressure. I told him to put the bottle down and step back. He took a step forward instead. I saw my mother standing in the hallway, frozen like she always was when he turned like this. She didn't say a word. She never did. Douglas pushed the drawer open with the side of his fist, grabbed the envelope, and waved it like it was a trophy. He said maybe he should take care of it since I clearly didn't know how. I moved toward him, my voice low and steady. I'd learned a long time ago that yelling didn't work with men like him. He raised his hand not to hit me, but to make a point. He said no one would believe me if anything happened. Then he said the thing that made the world tilt. He said he was tired of pretending Lily was his problem. Lily had wandered out of her room, still holding the stuffed bear she slept with. She was 6. She didn't speak, but her eyes were wide, soft, innocent. She didn't understand what was happening. She never should have had to. I told her to go back to her room, but Douglas saw her and smiled in that twisted way that made my skin crawl. He pointed the bottle at me and said I should have given him what he wanted because now look who was in the way. The gun came out of nowhere. He kept it in the cabinet behind the flour container, a place I had memorized but never touched. He pulled it out like it belonged to him more than anything else in that house. My lungs tightened. My hand instinctively went behind me, trying to push Lily back, but the moment was already moving too fast. His voice was steady now, colder. He said maybe this would finally teach me to respect what's his. The sound of the gunshot didn't feel real. It was a crack that split the night wide open. Lily fell before I even registered what had happened. Her body went limp, small hands slipping from the bear she'd held. I didn't see blood. I just saw stillness. a kind of stillness I never want to see again. The world narrowed to a tunnel. My knees hit the floor next to her. I pressed my hand against her chest, desperate to feel movement. I whispered her name like a prayer. The air smelled like gunpowder and cheap bourbon. Douglas stood there like it wasn't real, like he hadn't done it. Then he tilted his head, watching me, and said, "She's dead." His voice was flat, like he was reading a line. He didn't check. He didn't care. It was a statement meant to break me. Something in me snapped the other way. I pulled her against me, feeling the faintest rise of her chest. She was alive. Barely, but she was. I reached for the phone on the counter, but Douglas moved faster, calling 911 first. He started yelling into the receiver about how I attacked him, about how I had snapped. I heard the lies as if they were practiced. He knew exactly what he was doing. He put the phone down and pointed the gun at the wall near me, firing another shot. The splinters from the cabinet stung my shoulder as the bullet grazed me. Pain seared through the top of my arm. It wasn't deep, but it forced me to move. I dragged Lily behind the overturned table, flipping it with a burst of strength I didn't know I still had. My mother whispered something from the hallway, but it was lost under the ringing in my ears. Douglas's breathing grew heavier, uneven. He called my name like a warning. He said no one would believe a soldier over a man like him. His voice was too calm for what he'd just done. He thought this was control, but I could feel it shifting. I kept one hand on Lily's chest, counting every faint rise. My other hand reached for my phone. I dialed 911. My voice shook, but I forced it steady, giving the address, the situation, the words I had trained myself to say when panic wanted to eat me alive. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line. I didn't say I was already bleeding. I didn't say I was terrified. I just said my daughter needed help. Douglas kept pacing. He shouted that the police were already on their way, that they'd see the gun in my hand and believe his story. He thought the world still worked on his terms. The table shielded us, but the air around us was electric with danger. I lifted Lily into my arms, whispering against her hair. She didn't move, but I felt warmth against my chest. That warmth was all that mattered. I waited for the moment his back turned, then I made the only choice I could. I ran. My bare feet hit the tile, then the porch steps, then the cold sidewalk. The night air hit my lungs like ice. My heart pounded so loud it drowned out everything else. Lily was light in my arms, too light. I didn't look back. I knew if I did, he'd still be standing there holding that gun like a promise. The sound of sirens in the distance was faint but real. My shoulder burned. My breath came in short bursts, but my grip on her never faltered. For the first time that night, fear wasn't the only thing inside me. Something harder was taking its place. Something that whispered, "Not this time." If you believe parents must protect children, hit like and comment your city. I ran until my lungs burned and the night blurred around me. My bare feet slapped against the sidewalk, the summer air heavy and wet against my skin. I didn't know exactly where I was going. I just knew I had to get Lily away from that house, away from the sound of his voice, away from the smell of bourbon and gunpowder. I followed the streetlights like they were a path laid out just for me, each pool of yellow light a small island in the dark. My shoulder throbbed with every step. The wound wasn't deep, but it burned like a reminder that the night wasn't over. Lily's weight pressed against my chest, her breathing shallow and fragile. I whispered her name over and over like a promise I wasn't ready to break. The road curved and opened into the Cape Fear Riverfront Park near downtown Wilmington. Spanish moss hung from the branches overhead, stirring gently in the humid night breeze. The river lay still under the glow of the street lamps, reflecting faint light like a sheet of black glass. My legs gave out near the bench facing the water. The wood was rough and damp with night air, but I didn't care. I collapsed onto it, holding Lily tight, rocking her slightly, trying to convince both of us we were still here. My breath came in uneven gasps, my shoulder ached, and the world smelled like salt water and asphalt. For the first time since the shot, I let my body tremble. I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. Not the kind that made me jump, the kind that belonged to someone who had spent years walking with purpose. An older man appeared at the edge of the path. White hair ball cap pulled low posture straight in a way that only ever belonged to men who had worn a uniform long enough for it to become part of their bones. His eyes swept over me and Lily, taking in the wound, the fear, the silence. He didn't panic. He didn't crowd me. He just raised one hand, palm open, like someone who knew what a cornered person looked like. He spoke softly, but his voice carried weight. He asked if I needed help. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He pointed to his ear and then to the small hearing aid tucked beneath his cap. He couldn't hear well, but he could read everything that mattered. I said hospital. He didn't waste time asking questions. He pulled out an old flip phone and made a call with steady hands. While he waited, he crouched down slowly so he wasn't towering over me. His jacket smelled faintly of pine and machine oil. His eyes weren't soft, but they weren't cold either. They were steady. When the cab pulled up, he helped me to my feet without touching me. That kind of respect didn't have to be taught. It came from years of understanding where boundaries kept people alive. I climbed into the back seat, clutching Lily to me. The man climbed in beside us. He didn't say a word during the ride. He just wrote something on a small notepad he pulled from his pocket. When he handed it to me, it said his name was William Harding. The handwriting was neat and sure. Beneath his name was a short line, "I'm retired military. You're safe." The hospital came into view fast. Cape Fear Valley Medical Center glowed like a beacon under the harsh fluorescent lights. My legs wobbled as I stepped out of the cab. William followed close, but not too close. The automatic doors hissed open and the cold air inside hit me like a wall. Nurses at the triage desk looked up, eyes widening, when they saw Lily limp in my arms and the blood soaking through the fabric on my shoulder. I said my name like it was the only thing holding me together. "Abigail Monroe, my daughter needs help." They moved fast. They took Lily from me with practiced hands, their voices calm and controlled. A nurse guided me to a chair, another pressed gauze against my shoulder. I wanted to follow Lily, but they told me to sit still to let them work. William stood a few feet away, hat in hand, shoulders square, like a man who had stood in rooms like this before. His presence wasn't loud. It was solid. The kind of solid that keeps people from falling apart. I pulled my phone from my pocket with shaking fingers, but it wasn't just my phone. Somewhere in the chaos, I'd grabbed Douglas's too. The black case was scratched, the screen smeared, but it was working. My heart thudded when I realized what I was holding. This wasn't just a phone. It was a vault. His messages, his calls, his photos, his lies. Everything he thought he controlled was sitting in my lap. A nurse came back saying Lily was stable but needed more observation. The word stable felt like a rope I could grip even as everything else tilted. They stitched my shoulder with quick, sure movements. William stayed in the waiting area, silent, the notepad on his knee. When the nurse stepped away, he tore off a sheet of paper and handed it to me. It read, "You did what you had to do. It's not over, but you're not alone." For the first time since the gunshot, I felt something close to air filling my lungs. I opened Douglas's phone and saw the home screen. No passcode. Of course, he never thought he'd need to protect his secrets. The messages glared at me. Unpaid debts, threats, texts about the check, voice notes with slurred words, and then a folder I hadn't seen before. My fingers hovered over it. I wasn't ready. Not yet. I locked the screen and slipped it into my bag. The nurse told me the police would want to speak to me soon. I nodded, but my stomach tightened. I knew Douglas. He wouldn't just sit and wait. He'd already made his call. He'd already told his story. Somewhere out there, a version of the night was being written that wasn't true. William leaned forward slightly, tapping the notepad. Another line appeared beneath his name. "Trust what you know. I've seen men like him before. He's not untouchable." I didn't know who this man really was, but the steadiness in his eyes settled something inside me. For the first time that night, I wasn't running alone. But the relief didn't last long. On the small television bolted to the corner of the waiting room, a local news alert flashed across the screen. My name was already there. A woman accused in a domestic shooting. The headline was clean. Cold. Wrong. Douglas's story had already found its way into the world. My pulse spiked again. Fear crept back in, but this time it found something harder in its path. I reached into my bag and touched the phone. The black box. The truth he didn't know I had. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. When I finally sat in the sterile fluorescent light of the hospital waiting room with Douglas's black phone heavy in my bag, my hands trembled not from adrenaline, but from the weight of the choice in front of me. I did not plan to pry. I did not plan to become a thief of secrets, but the device in my lap was the closest thing to truth I had. He had kept his life in plain sight, thinking no one would ever look, and in that arrogance he had left me a map. I remembered a detail from years of small observations. A careless brag about a date he never forgot, an anniversary he repeated, the way men repeat lies until they feel like facts. I pressed the screen and the numbers I thought of held like a latch opening, and for a moment the room dissolved into text and timestamps and little blue bubbles that meant everything. I am not going to tell you how to do anything. I will tell you what unspooled inside that phone and how my hands shook as I read it, because the story of what I found matters more than the mechanics of getting there. The first folder I opened was banal at first glance receipts and messages that could be mistaken for ordinary domestic clutter, except they formed a pattern that was anything but ordinary. There were texts to a handful of names I didn't recognize references to, amounts owed, and dates due, curt shorthand about payoffs and hush money. Then there were photos of bank statements cropped and dated showing withdrawals that matched the pockets of cash I had seen vanish from our kitchen counter. A string of voice notes followed, slurred and defensive in tone, in which he discussed arrangements with men who sounded impatient and small. I listened to one twice and then sat back in my chair and let the oxygen in the room steady me. The voice said in a way that was not hidden, "You need to pay this now," and the way he said it made it clear he was not asking for himself but for someone who expected results. As I scrolled, a hidden folder blinked at me like a secret door. I did not open it at first. I put the phone away for an hour, talked to the nurse who had become a quiet ally, and watched Lily sleep under the steady light of the pediatric ward. When I went back to the phone, my breath was small and cautious. The folder contained photos, images of documents, close-ups of wills, scanned pages of estate paperwork, pictures of checks and signatures, a messy revenge list of numbers and amounts. There were timestamps on the photos that placed them in the months after my mother had been laid off the second time, in the months that his debts had deepened. Interspersed among the financial photos were videos. At first, they seemed like nothing more than home movies, another man's archive of drunken nights. But the videos were different. They were recordings he had taken of arguments, of my mother crying, of him ranting into the camera about how some people in his life were nothing but liabilities. In one clip, he laughed as he filmed hands shaking and said words I can still taste when I retell them, that if something had to be done, it would be done, and it would cost what it cost. It was not a threat phrased like a threat. It was confession disguised as casual cruelty. The more I scrolled, the clearer the outline of motive became. This was not a random act of rage. There were ledger's unpaid notices and a cascade of small messages to lenders that together spelled desperation. He had motive beyond his temper. He had financial pressure that explained why a man who otherwise loved appearances might choose to resolve a problem permanently rather than quietly. I sat there and let the pieces organize themselves into a picture that could be used, could be shown, could be subpoenaed, if I did the hard, careful work of keeping everything intact. I called Sergeant Marcus Hale because he was someone who had been on the other end of my calls when I was scared and had never once suggested I handle things alone. He answered on the second ring, and his voice low and steady was exactly what I needed. I told him what I had without spilling the details that might compromise anything, and he told me to breathe and to keep the phone exactly as it was until we could get legal eyes on it. He said the word chain of custody and told me not to upload a single image to any social feed. He said, do not under any circumstance let anything be public until we secure it. That was not a lecture. It was a lifeline. Marcus arranged for me to contact military legal assistance, and he gave me the number for Major Isabella Ross at JAG, who had a reputation for being precise and relentless in equal measure. I left the hospital knowing two things: Lily was stable enough to go home with protection, and the phone in my bag had to be treated like evidence, not like gossip. The tactical calm I had learned under sergeants and in ruck marches became the surface of my reaction. I moved with purpose. I made copies of every image on the phone using an authorized channel Marcus recommended pieces of paper and timestamps and witness names written down in a small notebook I kept zipped in my boot. I wrote down every conversation I could remember every time Douglas had referenced a debt or an argument about the check. I called the neighbor who had a doorbell camera I had noticed months before, a young man who lived 2 houses down and seemed to have a hobby with cameras. He was reluctant at first, but when I explained my voice taut and low that it was about my daughter, his tone changed. He checked the footage and found a clip that showed Douglas leaving the house that night and returning moments later with a large duffel bag. It was not proof of guilt by itself, but it was another tile in the mosaic. Major Ross told me to write down names of anyone who might corroborate the financial picture: the neighbors, the barista who had seen him furious one morning, the landlord who had mailed him notices. We made a list together methodically, like planners drawing up supply lines, and Marcus reminded me again about chain of custody. He met me at a neutral location with 2 witnesses and watched while I handed over the original phone in a sealed envelope to a JAG team member who placed it in evidence with a log number and a timestamp. They performed a forensic extraction in a controlled environment and provided me with copies and a written receipt of everything taken. I did not post one single screenshot, not even the smallest clipped image, because Marcus and Major Ross made it clear that an uncontrolled leakage could let the defense argue contamination and throw the whole case. That was tactical patience. While the lawyers moved, I kept making phone calls. I contacted a clinician to document Lily's condition and get a medical record that reflected the injuries and the treatments. I asked the nurse for a statement about what the triage had done, and the RN agreed to write one. Each little piece of paper, each recorded call, each time-stamped image was a pebble in a dam I was building against the lie Douglas was already spreading on the local airwaves. The more evidence I assembled, the clearer his motive became. The math of his debts and the timing of the photos and voice notes showed a man who saw my paycheck as a solution to an urgent problem. Those facts would not console me, but they would make a courtroom understand why a person like him might choose to manufacture a story about being attacked. I felt a simmering anger that was not base or unmoored. It was discipline turned inward into strategy. Every time I felt the old shame nudge at the edges, I wrote down what he had said, who had seen him where the money went. I practiced telling the truth out loud so it would not wobble when a prosecutor asked for it. I slept in short bursts and woke each time with a list of things to do. No one had promised me justice. No one had told me it would be fast. But I had a phone full of his confessions and a network that trusted me enough to move carefully. I had the truth in my hands, and I would not let him weaponize the night against us a second time. When the door to Lily's room slid open early the next morning, I expected to see a nurse or Major Ross. Instead, it was the older man from the riverfront, the one who had called the cab without asking questions. His posture was still precise, his cap in hand, his eyes as steady as the night I first saw him. He handed me a small folded piece of paper, the kind that seemed to belong to a different time. On it, in bold, careful letters, were 3 words: "Now we fight." I looked up at him, searching for the meaning beneath those words, and that's when he said his name out loud for the first time. Lieutenant General William Harding, United States Army, retired. The weight of the name hung in the air between us. Men like him didn't have to raise their voices to make walls move. He told me quietly that he had already made 2 calls, one to an old colleague at Fort Liberty, one to an attorney at JAG. I didn't fully understand the scope of what that meant yet, but the way he said it made it clear that the storm that had been crushing my chest had shifted ever so slightly. Within 2 hours, Major Isabella Ross walked through the hospital doors in full uniform, calm, crisp, carrying a leather folder under her arm. She introduced herself without fuss. She didn't touch me. She didn't offer false comfort. She simply said, "We're going to make this official. We build a fortress of evidence, not vengeance." Her tone was steady, like the voice of someone who'd stood beside enough soldiers in storms they thought they couldn't survive. Through Harding's connections, the Fort Liberty Judge Advocate General's office moved faster than I could have on my own. Because I was active duty JAG, could represent and advise me as a service member, even though the crime itself happened off post. Civilian prosecution would still go through the local district attorney, but the JAG team could protect me from legal missteps and ensure my rights weren't trampled in the meantime. By late afternoon, a two-person military police detail arrived at the hospital. Their presence wasn't loud, but they were visible enough to make the staff glance twice. Their job was protection, not arrest. They escorted me from the pediatric floor to the conference room where Harding and Major Ross had set up a legal strategy meeting. Major Ross spread documents across the table like puzzle pieces. She started by outlining exactly what was at stake. Because Douglas had already gone to the media with a fabricated version of events controlling the narrative wasn't just about defense. It was about making sure the truth was documented, corroborated, and protected before it could be buried under his lies. She walked me through the first steps, filing for an emergency protective order to keep Douglas away from Lily and me, securing Lily's status with Child Protective Services so that no one could twist custody during the investigation, and drafting my first affidavit with precise language that would stand in both military and civilian court. Harding leaned against the wall, his arms crossed but his eyes sharp, occasionally nodding as Ross explained the mechanics of the legal machine to me. He wasn't giving orders, he was making sure the gears moved. It was clear he'd done this before. Not this exact battle, but enough battles like it to know the rhythm. He wasn't intervening as a general. He was intervening as someone who had built bridges inside a system that didn't always move for ordinary people. I handed Ross the logbook I'd kept since the night of the shooting and the phone chain documentation from the JAG evidence tech. She nodded in approval. This, she said, tapping the papers, is why we're going to bury his story with facts. She assigned one of the MPs to stay with me at all times for the next 72 hours while the restraining order moved through the court. The other MP would shadow Lily's hospital room. It wasn't theater. Douglas had connections in town. This was about ensuring he didn't corner me before the law did its work. The JAG tech team finished the forensic extraction on Douglas's phone. They created an encrypted drive with every file logged and time-stamped, preserving the integrity for court. They also submitted copies of the key financial files to the local DA liaison and flagged the inheritance documents. Harding made one quiet call to a friend still inside the Pentagon to ensure the chain of custody on anything military-related wouldn't get lost in bureaucratic fog. He didn't ask for favors. He asked for precision. But while we were building the legal fortress, Douglas was busy spreading rot. Late that night, one of the MPs showed me a blog post from a local crime and community site. The headline was simple and brutal. Soldier at Fort Liberty involved in domestic shooting, questions raised. The article didn't say outright that I was guilty, but it didn't have to. It framed the night the way Douglas wanted angry veteran drunken fight tragic accident. The comment section burned with strangers turning my pain into rumor. Ross saw the article and didn't flinch. She picked up her phone and called the Fort Liberty Public Affairs office. Within an hour, a press officer arrived and coordinated with her to draft a factual statement, not an emotional plea, just clean lines confirming that the incident was under investigation, that credible evidence was being handled by both civilian and military authorities, and that the soldier in question had legal representation. No drama, just control. Harding said quietly, "You never fight lies with fire. You smother them with stone." We spent that night in the conference room while Lily slept upstairs. Harding sat at the far end, silent, reading every document like he was still active duty. Ross and two JAG paralegals went line by line through the affidavit drafts. They explained each paragraph, making sure I understood the difference between emotion and admissible testimony. They asked me to recount every sound, every movement, every word from the night of the shooting. Not as a victim's wail, but as a witness statement. I told it all, voice cracking only once when I said Lily's name. Ross didn't interrupt. She wrote it down exactly as I said it. At 2 a.m., the MPs rotated their shift. One of them brought in coffee that tasted like burned paper but steadied my shaking hands. Harding, still in his same quiet corner, finally spoke. He told me about a woman 20 years ago, another soldier, another man who thought the world would believe him over her. He said she won, not because she shouted louder, but because she made every lie collapse under the weight of truth, documented with precision. "We don't need noise," he said. "We build pressure, and pressure cracks liars." By the time dawn light crept through the blinds, we had a strategy. Ross had filed the emergency protective order through both state and military channels. Harding had reached out to a family advocacy officer to ensure Lily had a secured pediatric care plan. MPs had coordinated with local police so that if Douglas tried to approach jurisdiction, would not become a loophole. The JAG team scheduled a formal statement with the DA's office and planned to deliver the full phone evidence with their legal chain intact. I stood by the window of the hospital looking at the parking lot below the early sun, cutting through the mist. Just 2 nights before everything had been a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Now it was still a nightmare, but it was contained. It had borders. It had people who knew how to fight with laws and not just fists. I felt something settle in me, a kind of hope that wasn't loud or reckless. A soldier's kind of hope, controlled, aimed. Douglas wasn't done. Men like him rarely just fold when their lies are challenged. But now, for the first time, I wasn't the scared girl in a locked bedroom. I was Sergeant Abigail Monroe. And behind me, the military machine was moving not to destroy, but to protect, to document, to hold the line. The fight ahead wouldn't be clean. It never is. But I had allies' strategy and truth. And that in a world built on his lies was enough to make him afraid. The day of the trial began under a clean Carolina sky, the kind that looks soft but carries a bite in the air. I stood outside the Cumberland County Courthouse, the flag above the steps barely stirring the sound of press cameras clicking like small insects gathering around light. I wore my Army Class A uniform because it wasn't just fabric. It was armor. The crease on my sleeves was sharp, my shoes polished to a mirror. Lily's hospital bracelet was tucked inside my pocket, pressed against my palm, like a reminder of why I was standing there. Beside me, Lieutenant General William Harding stood in a dark suit, hands behind his back, posture unshaken. Major Isabella Ross was at my other shoulder briefing with the Assistant District Attorney. The prosecutor, Amanda Lee, was a sharp-eyed woman in a navy blazer, her binder fat with evidence. The courthouse doors opened and the press leaned in as if the building itself was exhaling. Subpoenas had already been served, witnesses had been called. The story was no longer just mine. It was public. Douglas arrived minutes later in a charcoal suit, pretending to look like a man of dignity. He walked with that same smug slant to his mouth that I'd seen since childhood, the one that used to make my stomach twist. His lawyer, a public defender named Grant Keller, walked beside him with a stiff expression that said he already knew what was coming but had to march anyway. When Douglas glanced up and saw me in uniform, flanked by Harding and the JAG team, the look in his eyes flickered. Just once, but I caught it. A single crack in the facade. Inside, the courtroom smelled like old wood and disinfectant. The benches creaked with reporters, neighbors, and strangers who had consumed the story like oxygen. On one side, Douglas sat stiffly trying to mimic innocence. On the other, I sat behind the DA's table not as a soldier on trial, but as a witness whose life had been burned into evidence folders. The judge, a tall woman with silver hair named Judge Celia Grant, called the court to order. Her gavel didn't sound theatrical. It sounded final. The opening statements began with Amanda Lee stepping to the front, her voice steady and deliberate. She didn't open with a scream or a sob story. She opened with timestamps, medical records, and a single phrase. This is a case about control about lies, and about a woman who refused to die quietly in someone else's story. She laid out the framework. A stepfather who had debts, a confrontation, a gun, a child nearly killed. She spoke in layers, not waves, letting the facts build like a tide. The defense countered, trying to paint Douglas as a man haunted by his own past, as someone who had made a mistake during an emotional outburst. Grant Keller leaned into soft words like confusion and accident. He even dared to mention Douglas's service to community organizations that no one in the room believed. But the trial was not about pretty speeches. It was about the black phone. When the evidence technician took the stand, the room stilled. Every chain of custody step was read into the record, every file cataloged. When the technician pressed play on the first clip, the room felt airless. The video appeared on the monitor. Douglas's voice filled the courtroom, drunk, slurring, ranting into the dark kitchen about her useless paycheck and dead weight. He laughed between lines, a laugh that had no warmth in it. In the second video, he slammed a drawer and muttered about getting rid of problems. The jury didn't look at me. They looked at him. The next file showed the photos of the inheritance documents he'd hidden the bank statements with overdrafts, the text messages to bookies calling him by first name, hounding him for money. Amanda Lee walked the jury through every message like a scalpel cutting through skin. She read one aloud, dated 2 weeks before the shooting. "I'll have access to the funds soon. She won't stop me." My throat tightened, but I didn't cry. I had cried too much already. When Amanda called me to the stand, the room felt smaller. I raised my right hand and swore to tell the truth. I sat in the chair, my back-straight uniform collar stiff against my neck. She guided me gently at first, asking me about my service, my station at Fort Liberty, my rank. She wanted the jury to see me not as an idea, but as a person who had stood for something real. Then she led me through the night. I spoke about the smell of bourbon, the heat of his voice, the way the floor had felt beneath my knees when Lily went limp in my arms. I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. Truth spoken plainly carries more weight than theatrics. When the defense cross-examined Keller tried to soften the edges of Douglas's actions, he asked if I had ever raised my voice to him if stress from military service had made me aggressive. I met his eyes and answered every question without wavering. No, I had not. Yes, I served honorably. No, I had never brandished a weapon off duty. Yes, I was terrified. His strategy crumbled the more I refused to play the role of a broken woman. I was not broken. I was a soldier, a mother, and the witness to my own truth. Then came the moment no one expected. Amanda called my mother, Laura Monroe, to the stand. My stomach twisted because for years she had been the silence that made his cruelty echo louder. She walked slowly, her hands clenched in front of her eyes, flicking to Douglas and then to me. She looked tired, like a woman who had lived a lifetime in shadows. Amanda asked her simple questions at first, about their marriage, about Douglas's debts, about the night of the shooting, and then softly she asked why she had never spoken up before. Laura looked at me. Really looked at me. And for the first time in my adult life, I saw the war in her face, the love she had buried under fear. Her voice cracked when she said I was so afraid. The room went silent. Even the reporters stopped moving. Her words weren't poetic. They didn't need to be. They broke something open. The facade Douglas had worn like armor cracked wide enough for everyone to see the rotting underneath. Keller tried to object, but the judge overruled him. Laura described nights of being locked out of accounts of watching him count cash from gambling, of whispered threats when she suggested leaving. She told them about the day he took Lily's toy and smashed it because no child should think they run this house. She told them about his temper, how it didn't just flare, it lingered. Each word landed like a hammer. Douglas took the stand against his lawyer's advice. He tried to look calm, tried to lace his sentences with pity, but his voice trembled when Amanda played the third recording. It was him on a Tuesday night saying clearly, "If I have to choose between my life and theirs, they lose." The jurors shifted. His own words hung in the air like a noose he'd tied for himself. When Amanda asked him to explain the debts he snapped, the mask tore off. He yelled about being pushed about a woman who thought she could embarrass me. He slammed his fist against the railing and the bailiffs stepped forward. The judge banged her gavel once firm. Keller put his head in his hands. That was the moment. Not the video, not the affidavit. That single outburst showed everyone who he truly was. The quiet veneer of respectability he'd built for years collapsed under his own rage. The jury stared at him not like a man wronged, but like a man finally unmasked. The rest happened quickly. Closing arguments ran their course. Amanda's voice was measured almost gentle. This is not about a single night. This is about a pattern. This is about control. And this is about a 6-year-old girl who almost didn't get to grow up because one man decided his debts mattered more than her life. Keller had nothing left but hollow words. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they filed back into the courtroom, their faces told the story before the foreman spoke. Guilty on all major counts: aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, attempted murder, reckless endangerment, unlawful discharge of a firearm. When the judge read the sentence, 40 years without parole, the sound that left Douglas wasn't a scream. It was something smaller, a a man realizing the world would keep turning without him. As the bailiffs led him away in cuffs, the cameras flashed. Laura sat with her hands over her face. Harding rested one hand briefly on my shoulder, the only gesture of comfort he ever allowed himself. Amanda Lee gave a small nod, her job done. Ross whispered, "Fortress held." I didn't cry. I didn't cheer. I breathed. For the first time in years, the air didn't taste like fear. It tasted like space. When the reporters rushed forward outside the courthouse shouting my name, I didn't give a speech. I didn't owe anyone that. I just held Lily's hand, small, warm, wrapped in mine, and walked down those courthouse steps. The flashbulbs behind me burned bright, but they didn't blind me anymore. And if you believe survivors deserve protection, comment one word that matters to you. The letter came 3 weeks after the guilty verdict, tucked into an envelope with my mother's handwriting on the outside. It smelled faintly of the old cedar chest from the hallway closet where she kept holiday decorations and family photos, a smell that used to mean something gentle before it was wrapped around something poisonous. I recognized his handwriting on the inside before I even unfolded the pages. Neat, deliberate, the kind of penmanship a man uses when he wants to pretend he's civilized. He wrote the same way he spoke when he was trying to charm someone who didn't know him yet. The letter was full of the kind of words I had learned to stop trusting. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I was drunk. I was scared. I didn't know what I was doing." He wrote about Lily like she was a memory he wanted to borrow about me, like I was some ungrateful soldier who had ruined his life over a misunderstanding. He said if I could just forgive him, the judge might be more lenient. The press might see a man worthy of mercy. He sent 2 more letters that week, each more desperate than the last. The second was scrawled faster, the loops of his letters uneven like a mask starting to slip. The third came through my mother, who showed up at my apartment in Fayetteville with trembling hands and an envelope she could barely hold. She told me he had called her from jail, telling her to talk to me, telling her that forgiveness could be healing, as if I owed him my healing. She cried while saying it, but even through her tears, I could see the shape of old fear pressing down on her shoulders. It wasn't really her voice asking. It was his echo still lodged inside her. The district attorney's office had already warned me this might happen. Victims often get letters. Some are manipulative, some pathetic, some both. I could have ignored them, but part of me wanted to hear it once, not because I owed him a thing, but because I wanted to look him in the eyes when I told him what he no longer had power to take. So a supervised mediation was scheduled in a secured room at the detention facility. There was a glass wall between us 2 guards by the door, and Major Ross sitting at my side like a wall of iron. He was thinner than I remembered the orange jumpsuit, stripping him of the illusions he had built his whole life around. He smiled when he saw me, but the smile didn't touch his eyes. It never had. He started with the script. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. It was a mistake. I miss Lily. I miss you." His voice cracked in practiced places, but I had lived too many years inside his walls to fall for his choreography. He said we were family. He said forgiveness was strength. He said the newspapers would listen to me. He said the sentencing might go easier if I told the judge I believed in second chances. I let him talk. Not because he deserved it, but because I wanted him to hear what silence felt like when it no longer belonged to him. Then I leaned forward close enough that he could see every inch of the uniform I wore that day. I told him I would never give him what he wanted. I told him he didn't own my name, my story, or my forgiveness. I told him Lily would grow up never needing to remember him, because some people do not get to keep space in the future. His smile faltered. He started to say my name, but I cut him off with a single word. "No." Ross ended the session there. The guards escorted him back down the hallway. He tried to say something else, but the sound disappeared behind the metal door, and for once I didn't follow the echo. It belonged to him, and I was done carrying it. 2 weeks later, the sentencing hearing came. The judge imposed restitution not because I needed his money, but because the law recognized the cost of what he had done. He would pay for Lily's ongoing care for the hospital bills for the damage he had inflicted in numbers, even if he could never touch the real price. There were supervised therapy orders for my mother, too, not as punishment, but as acknowledgement that silence under threat leaves scars of its own. I stood in the courtroom not as a woman asking for justice anymore, but as someone who had already built it with my own hands. When the judge asked if I wanted to make a statement on his behalf, I shook my head. I told the court that forgiveness is not currency, and I would not trade it for a lighter sentence. The judge nodded slowly. The reporters scribbled, and Douglas stared at the table, his jaw tight, the mask gone for good. Outside, the air was warm. Lily was at home with Harding's daughter drawing chalk suns on the porch. I walked down the courthouse steps and felt the world open just a little more with each step. The apology wasn't real. It never had been, but the boundary was. And this time, the line belonged to me. Healing is not loud. It doesn't arrive with the sound of gavels or the click of cameras. It comes slowly, like the first breath after holding it too long, like the soft scrape of chalk in Lily's hands on the porch floor when the world had finally stopped spinning. In the months after the sentencing, I learned that survival isn't the end of the war. It's the beginning of a quieter one. Lily started speech therapy at Cape Fear Pediatric Center. Her first sessions were clumsy and tender, her small hands clutching her drawing board, while the therapist encouraged her to make sounds she'd hidden behind silence. Some days she refused to speak at all. Other days she whispered single letters that broke me open and stitched me back together at the same time. The hospital bills were covered by restitution, but the real cost was time patience, the steady presence she had been denied for too long. I built our routines like sandbags against a storm. Morning walks, therapy sessions twice a week, short visits to her new school with a guidance counselor by her side. Slowly, the girl who had curled into herself like a leaf began to stretch toward the sun again. My mother changed too, not overnight, but in the fragile, shaking way someone learns to stand after a long fall. Laura Monroe enrolled in a survivor support group at a local women's center. She sat in rooms with other women who had once mistaken fear for love, silence for protection. She didn't know how to speak at first, but each week she came home a little less like a shadow. Sometimes she would bring Lily a cupcake or a small toy from the center's thrift store. Sometimes she just sat on our porch drinking coffee without shaking. She still carried the weight of her silence, but it was no longer crushing her chest alone. She had finally started handing pieces of it to the world that could hold it without breaking. When I returned to Fort Liberty after my leave, the base felt different. Not because it had changed, but because I had. Sergeant Monroe walked through the gates with a story everyone had heard in whispers, but I didn't hide from it. Harding met me outside the administration building, hands in his pockets, the same quiet authority that had held me together when everything fell apart. He told me he'd used my case to light a fuse. The base leadership had convened a task force Sentinel program. Its mission was simple and brutal in its clarity. No soldier facing domestic abuse would be left alone to fight through a maze of silence again. The Sentinel program was built to bridge the gap between military resources and civilian protection. Mandatory awareness briefings were implemented across units. JAG response teams were put on rapid deployment for domestic incidents involving service members. Military police were given clear protocols to protect, not just observe. A chaplaincy warm line was set up to connect families to safe havens at any hour. Harding said he'd spent half his career watching soldiers slip through cracks the size of battlefields. This time, they would not slip. The first time I stood in front of a Sentinel briefing uniform pressed, watching young soldiers who looked the way I once did, too proud to ask for help, too scared to speak, I felt the world tilt a little closer to something better. The ripple effect didn't stop at the gates. The Cumberland County District Attorney's Office announced a new initiative on domestic firearm misuse. My case had forced a hard conversation in rooms where people used to turn their heads away. New protective order enforcement measures were signed into policy. Coordination between local law enforcement and military bases was tightened to ensure that a restraining order didn't end at the edge of the fence line. The law that had felt like a distant, slow-moving machine suddenly had teeth, and they were sharp. Lily started kindergarten again with a speech therapist by her side. She still didn't say much, but she laughed now, loud-free, unafraid of how the sound might echo. My mother sat in the stands at the fall festival with a paper cup of cider in her hand, and for the first time, she didn't flinch when someone said Douglas's name. Harding retired fully that winter, his last official act being to hand over the Sentinel program to the new commanding officer. Ross got a commendation she said she didn't want, but her eyes softened when she looked at Lily at the ceremony. One evening in late November, I returned alone to the courthouse steps. The air was cool, crisp enough to carry the sound of my boots as they met the concrete. The building loomed the same way it had that day of the verdict. But this time, the weight pressing on my chest wasn't fear. It was memory. It was the knowledge of a war fought not with guns, but with truth, with precision, with the stubborn refusal to disappear. I closed my eyes and exhaled. No one cheered. No one clapped. It wasn't that kind of ending. It wasn't vengeance. It was the slow rebuild after the fire, the part of the story people don't see when the lights of the courtroom fade. Lily would grow. My mother would heal. The system, bruised and slow, had moved an inch closer to justice. And me, I would keep standing. Not as a woman defined by what was done to her, but as a soldier who learned to build fortresses of fact where fear once lived. The war was never really about revenge. It was about making sure no one else would have to fight it alone. The auditorium at Fort Liberty was packed that morning, the kind of quiet that hums before a speech people know will mean something. Rows of uniforms lined the seats, fresh recruits and seasoned NCOs side by side, the banners of the new Sentinel program hanging on either side of the stage. I stood behind the podium in my service uniform, a single new stripe stitched on my sleeve since the last time I'd stood in this room. Lily was at the back with Harding's daughter holding a small paper flag she'd made in therapy, a quiet reminder of why I was standing here at all. The lights above me were harsh but steady. I had rehearsed this speech 100 times, and yet the real thing still thrummed in my bones. I started with my name, my rank, my unit, the way every briefing begins. But this wasn't about tactics or weapons or missions. It was about surviving a war no one trains for. I told them about fear, not the kind that comes in firefights, but the kind that grows in kitchens and hallways, in locked rooms, in silence. I told them how one night a gunshot turned my life inside out, how the system was not built to save me, but how people inside it chose to move to act, to build something better. I looked at the rows of soldiers in front of me and saw versions of who I used to be, young, proud, silent. And I told them silence is not loyalty. Asking for help is not weakness. Protecting your family doesn't start with violence. It starts with truth, with strategy, with using every tool this uniform gives you. Harding had said once that justice needs soldiers who know how to fight on more than one battlefield. He was right. I walked them through the practical steps, the Sentinel hotline, the JAG Rapid Response Team, the military police protocols. I told them to memorize those numbers like they memorize rifle serials because they can save lives in ways a weapon never could. The room was still listening, not because of me, but because the story was real. I ended, the way I knew I would from the beginning, with the same words that had burned through me on the night everything changed. We didn't avenge, we enforced justice. My voice didn't shake. It landed like steel on the floor. The room rose in quiet applause, not wild, not loud, just the sound of something solid. I looked at Lily once more before stepping off the stage. She raised the paper flag and waved it, her smile wide and bright. I let the moment soak into my bones because this was what victory really looked like, not revenge, but a future. Tell me the one word that gives you strength and subscribe if you believe no one should be left behind.